So I'm just going to briefly introduce what's called the mobilities turn in the social sciences, and then I'll also talk a little bit more about how those are becoming materialised, how there's some attention being given to the material world. I'll give some examples of some personal projects that I've been involved in, which I guess you could say have involved some mobile methods. And I'll leave the kind of presentation hanging with a critique that's been made about the whole idea of the mobile methods paradigm or the mobilities paradigm. So I guess the underlying questions of the presentation that I'd like you to kind of hold as I talk are these. Can existing social scientific research methods that slow down and freeze experiences, i.e. interviews, focus groups and surveys, adequately capture mobile experiences, practices where the context of movement itself may be crucial to understanding the significance of the event, of the participant, rather than simply being read off from destination points and origins? Secondly, how do we research and represent mobile experiences? And thirdly, being there and seeing there, can we get close to the mobile practice itself without being present? Do we really need to kind of move with people as we do the research? So that, I guess they're rhetorical in a sense, because I'm kind of answering my own question, but that's kind of what's provoking the talk. So the mobilities turn in the social science then. Well, we kind of live in a world increasingly constituted through mobilities. So mobilities thinking really is a framework to understand mobile practices and cultures and to place this at the centre of social processes. So, things are increasingly on the move. We need to think about new ways of studying them. And this has been articulated by John Urry in his book Mobilities, where he says, mobilities paradigm places mobile practice and culture at the centre of social processes, and to explore mobile bodies in mobile context requires a range of approaches that diverge from traditional methodological approaches. So that's coming from kind of sociology, if you like. And similarly in geography, Tim Creswell has made the point that perhaps looking at space requires a different way of thinking about movement. And he makes the point that movement is not just merely moving from A to B. Meaning's inscribed with meaning as people move between those points or as movement takes place. So therefore we need new ways of studying it, or at least a different mindset in how we study it. So yeah, with that in mind, to sort of develop those techniques in order to accurately interpret, represent and understand the world increasingly constituted through mobilities, we therefore need to develop effective techniques to study such a world. So what might that look like? Well, I guess the mobilities approach looks at movement at different scales. So from macro level, that could be migration, that could be movement of information, of things, of items, through to kind of just movements, for example, walking through the door, moving in a room, sort of very micro level movements, dance even in Tim Creswell's book as a section on dancing. So it's kind of movements in all its forms. And that interest extends to block movement, potential movement or motility as it's being called, as well as immobilisation and forms of dwelling and placemaking. So there's also an interest in affect, so feelings and emotions, in place, in meanings, in cultures and representation, which is, as we know, typically concerns of the humanities. So it's engaging with the humanities to an extent. It's also a way of researching the ordinary, the mundane, taken for granted practice, what Bourdieu would call the hexis, taken for grantedness of everyday life, freezing that and giving attention to say gestures and conversations and experiences. I should say, coming from an urban planning background, perhaps this isn't particularly new in a sense. I would call it what somebody actually offered to me yesterday, a bricolage of methods under an umbrella that could be called mobile methods. So, for example, George Simmel, 19th century urban sociologist, very anti-positivist stance, looking at kind of the urban condition in the metropolis and mental life. Obviously not called mobile methods, but actually observing, documenting, theorising. And then we can see sort of the empirical side, if you like, in the Chicago School of Sociology of Robert Park, looking at urban conditions in New York, and developing Bloomer looking at symbolic interactionist approach. and really kind of talking about human behaviour in the context of social structures and physical environmental factors rather than genetic or individual personal characteristics. Okay, I guess the other point to make is that it's a productive relationship in generating research knowledge. So it's not about collecting data as such, it's about co-producing that data with participants. So there's a lot of emphasis of not just expecting the data to be there and to collect it, but actually to co-produce that data and to sort of almost expect the unexpected as things unfold in the process of generating that data. As I'll give an example from my project in a moment. I've put here there's an emphasis on the qualitative side of things. I think that's true, but however I would say that certainly for the work I've done, mobilities has been part of a mixed methods approach. I've used quantitative approaches and qualitative to kind of provide that compelling narrative with the findings. So for example, I'll just give you an example in my field that I sort of in transport studies, as it would be traditionally called in transport geographies. A lot of focus on the brute facts of movement, so measurements. You know, that obviously that's very important, but a mobilities approach might take a different stance of trying to understand, produce rich accounts of why that movement takes place, how it takes place, the experiences along those journeys from A to B. It would also engage perhaps with the fleeting instances of things that might happen on the journey from A to B, the sensory, the emotional. It would try and capture and try and represent those to the best of its ability. Not always possible, quite difficult, but it may attempt to do that. There is a prioritising on being there when doing this research around ethnography through co-presence of the research with the participant. Or at least to capture that through using technologies and to try and get the immediacy of the experience of moving. And there's also been attention to the kinesthetic, sort of bodily, embodied sensory aspects of how movement's accomplished. And also the less animated passive mobilities is becoming increasingly the focus of some researchers, as sort of dwelling in place or at hubs or transit interchanges. So mobile methods in practice. There isn't really a what is book, but there are two books that came out around 2010, 2011. Fincher, McGuinness and Murray provided an edited collection of research they regarded as representing sort of mobile methodological approaches to understanding movement in all its forms. Also, John Urry, Monica Busher and Katrine Witschger also produced a book around that time, again providing the edited collection of examples of mobile methods in sort of practice in research. And as I say, going back to the word bricolage, I really would regard those methods as a bricolage within that umbrella. So those methods can include observing people and things, participatory approaches, ethnography or autoethnography, activity or time-space diaries, virtual mobility, making use of technology, conversation, interaction analysis, imagining and envisioning perhaps different landscapes, movement landscapes, mapping and tracing, capturing atmosphere, attention on the multi-sensual and emotional mapping, memories, biographical interviewing, so thinking of past events, past movement, plotting, monitoring, juxtaposing places on the go or no longer on the go, and or focus on interspaces or dwell points, if you like. So, that's just a few I've put there, but that list could go on. So just to give you a few concrete examples then of people who've adopted a mobilities approach to what we call different modalities. We've got walking. Various authors looked at the practice of walking, whether kind of mundane everyday walking through to recreational journeys through the countryside. Eric Laurier's done a lot of work on driving and passengering. Cycling, my colleague Justine Spinney has done a lot of work around that. Indeed, my colleagues Colin Pooley on the study I'll talk about in a moment. Coach travel even, ferry travel, in this case in British Columbia, Canada, Vanini. and train travel. Watts has done some work on sort of that kind of effect in train carriages whilst on the move. So as you can see, these are quite, these are only in the sort of last decade or around last decade. So there's a profusion of studies that have adopted that mobilities lens to look at those different modalities. More recently, there's been a call to materialise mobile methods, to sort of bring them down to kind of attend, if you like, to my field, urban planning and design. How can we adopt the mobilities approach and apply it to the kind of materials around us and think about that in terms of design of the built environment and design of sort of micro features of the built environment, if you like. So Jensen's tried to articulate that in his book, Designing Mobilities, and it's really borrowed from Goffman's sort of staging metaphor, and has used the kind of front stage, backstage, where the front stage, the staging from above, as he calls it, will be the planning, regulations and institutions that inscribe the landscape with meaning in terms of the ideas behind the design and what the purpose was, like our windows here that open and close to control temperature. And then looking from the staging from below, how the kind of actors, if you like, people in this case, interact in that setting and the embodied experience and performances that they experience in doing so. So it's a way of kind of looking at this sort of intentionality, if you like, of the staging from above through planning, regulations, institutions, but then how that's performed from below. So it's a neat concrete example. We've all seen, haven't we, desire lines over grassed areas where people have avoided the path and taken the direct line. So it's been staged by the designers, but actually people have interacted and created their own route through the grassed area. Okay, so, and I guess, in other areas that I teach urban design, mobile methods have been happening over the last century in a sense, although they weren't called that. So Yangel's got a lovely page in his book, How to Study Public Life, where he kind of charts what he calls public life studies from sociology, geography, design, etc., etc. That all kind of inform his approach to non-architecture, if you like, urban design of the built environment. So just to give you, I've just pulled out a few here. So what we could regard as kind of heritage mobile methods, if you like. So Appleyard, Lynch's and Mayer's The View from the Road, where they considered highways as a vantage point to look at the landscape and used a windshield as a frame to look at the American urban condition, if you like, and then use cinematographic techniques and visual sequences of routes, so use technology at the time to portray those landscapes and then to question the aesthetics of the US urban environment and the role of the highway engineering kind of staging that, if you like. So that's an example. William H. White's 80s study of the social life of small urban spaces, looking at Lower Manhattan and thinking about how space is used, the interactions that take place, why those interactions take place, how they're encouraged, how they're deterred. And again, using at that time what was probably cutting edge technology of putting cameras around the city to understand, to capture and understand and replay and rethink what's going on in public space. So just turning to sort of personal projects where I and my colleagues have used, perhaps at the time, particularly for this project, we didn't really think of this as mobile methods in place in the mixed method study, but on reflection, I guess we were employing or at least entering the spirit of the mobilities paradigm, the mobilities thinking paradigm. So understanding walking and cycling, 2008 to 2011, 3-year study. This was really to sort of understand the urban condition in relation to short journeys in urban areas and the experiences of walking and cycling in urban areas. We chose 4 case study areas: Lancaster, Leeds, Leicester and Worcester. We conducted a social survey of residents, of a large sample of residents in those 4 areas to sort of get a sense of feeling and attitudes on and behaviours, if you like, on walking and cycling. We also did a spatial analysis of those towns, so we had an attention to the materiality, the connectivity, the levels of mixed use and the factors that are posited to encourage walking and cycling. We then did household interviews, some more static sit-down technique to understand that. And we also rode and walked with participants on regular journeys to kind of capture that experience and to really be on the move and to think about what are the things that enhance or detract from those journeys. And then some more immersive ethnography where we kind of lived with families for a number of weeks to look at the decision making around travel. And as Clark and Emma have pointed out, that's useful because it gives the participant greater control over the research process in a sense. They take you where they want to take you. They can fit it into their everyday life. They can demonstrate their practices. Arguably, they can articulate their thoughts better rather than sitting in a sofa in an interview saying, you know, this feels like that, you know, that. You're actually with them and things are unfolding as you're interviewing. And it situates those experiences in the wider context. The other project is Cycle Boom. I'm currently coming to the end of this project, 2013 to the end of this autumn. Again, that's used multi-methods to understand older cycling in the city, how older people navigate the city by bike. And for that, we use mobile observation and video elicitation. So a slight departure from understanding walking and cycling, where we rode and walked with people and interviewed them on the move. In this case, we reflected on those previous methods and thought, well, actually, it's really, really difficult to cycle side by side and interview in Britain. So we'll do an observational approach with cameras and technologies, capture that, and then replay it and do a sit-down interview to kind of elicit what was going on when you were riding through particular parts of space. So here's an example of Sean. You know, so traditional transport studies might look at a Strava or a GPS trace of Sean's route and say, okay, this is what he does to get to his home here. They might not even ask him, why hasn't he taken the direct route? You know, I don't know. So Sean does take a route that's not direct. We captured that. I'll just play a little bit. I won't play more.
As I cycle, I prefer to have almost a steady flow rather than the stop-start of 1,000 lights and a dozen buses in front of me. So this is why I've chosen to go this route. It's a bit longer. I think it's a lot safer, and you don't get so stressed as you're doing it.
Okay, so just from that small sequence, you can see he talks, it's longer, the rationale why it's longer, which is sort of counterintuitive. You think people want to take the direct routes. He wants flow, so momentum, keep moving. He wants to feel safer, and he doesn't want stress, although I'd argue there's moments of stress in that video, which indeed he goes on to point out the elements of stress on that continuum. So it allows planners to then think, how can we de-stress those points between A and B? How can we think about maintaining flow? How can we improve safety? Whereas previously they might only focus on the instrumental aspects, the safety aspects. So mobile ethnography, as my colleague Justin's highlighted it in a paper, mobile video ethnography can contribute to a new mobility agenda by facilitating more nuanced understandings of daily corporeal mobility, which move beyond seeing instrumental factors as solely determining why and how people move around. So hopefully that little clip gave you an example of Sean sort of articulating that. So it allows us to sort of play back the video with participants, allows them to kind of think about what they were doing, which is not always apparent, in sort of taken for granted movements. So a process of the researcher trying to articulate how they were feeling and what they were doing, and the researcher probing the participant around key events that might happen on the journey. So we found that really, really useful technique. Just to kind of finish, really, just to be aware that there has been a critique by Peter Merriman in the journal article in Mobility's Rethinking Mobile Methods. He's warned against the rush to kind of the use of novel tech. We all get excited about GoPros and various gizmos that we can start to use GPS and whatnot, virtual reality and all these things. And he's just putting a cautionary note on that. Let's not just rush to it because it's novel. Let's think about, is it fit for purpose? Is it the right tool to actually get at what we're trying to understand? I also posed the question at the start, is do we really need to be there to see there? Okay, and this is a point that Merriman makes really, is that, do we always need to do that? Can we resort to things like even just basic printed materials, Facebook, Twitter, blogs, news groups, where people are articulating the experiences of mobility or articulating their feelings, or even just posting videos to exemplify something that they just wanted to get out there around a particular mobility experience. So that's just kind of a cautionary article that's worth looking at just before you kind of all rush out excitedly to employ mobile methods. But I think the other thing is to think as a researcher, and certainly I've thought about this, about my practice as a researcher, and I believe research should be enjoyable as well in many respects. And I think that Jean-Jacques Rousseau's quotes here is great, really. It says, I almost cannot think when I stay in place. My body needs to be in motion for my mind to be there. And I certainly think of the research I've done of mobile ethnographies vis-a-vis sitting in somebody's house, having a cup of tea, talking about mobilities. Certainly the mobile methods for me really gets to the essence of what it is to be mobile and the challenges and the experiences that people have when they're mobile. So I would say from a personal level, it's definitely the right tool for understanding, say, walking and cycling in the city. It's proven really, really useful in my research. And I'd kind of urge people really just to go out and experiment, have a go, and see how that affects you as a researcher and the types of knowledge and information that you generate, as opposed to using more static methods. So I think I'll end it there. Thank you.